Now, let me tell you about the single most embarrassing diplomatic incident in the 400-year history of the galactic convergence. And yes, I was there, which makes it significantly more embarrassing for me personally. The year was what you humans would call a Tuesday, which, from what I understand, is already a terrible omen on your planet. The occasion was the Convergence Centennial Gala, held aboard the luxury station Aurelian Prime. 7 kilometers of polished iridium, zero-gravity ballrooms, and enough exotic cuisine to make a Vorath nutritionist weep openly into their nutrient paste. Every species of note had sent representatives. The Quelhari brought their ceremonial harmonic singers. The Drossian Collective sent 3 of their most prestigious mindweavers. The Peluvians arrived in that obnoxiously glittering ship they use specifically to make other species feel insecure about their hulls. And then there were the humans. Ambassador Priya Okonkwo arrived with a delegation of 4. The Peluvians had brought 67. Ambassador Okonkwo wore something she called a little black dress, which, I want to be clear, covered approximately 60% of her surface area. A fact that caused Delegate Thum of the methane-breathing Vorath to immediately recalibrate his atmospheric tolerance settings because he assumed she was suffering some kind of catastrophic suit failure and was preparing to die heroically in front of everyone. She was not dying. She was, in fact, having a fantastic time. This distinction would become a recurring theme of the evening. The gala's social director was a Quelhari named Siveth, meticulous, color-coordinated down to the sub-follicle level, and possessed of the kind of personality that could organize a supernova into a proper seeding chart. Siveth had been coordinating interspecies social events for 60 years. Siveth had managed the Drossian-Peluvian Accords dinner of 2287, which, if you don't know your history, involved a fistfight that technically constituted a war crime. Siveth handled it beautifully. Siveth was not prepared for Priya Okonkwo. She asked for something called hot sauce. Siveth told me later, the chromatic patterns across his crest cycling rapidly in what I recognized as low-grade existential distress. I told her our culinary team had prepared a masterwork of 12-dimensional flavor harmonics. She said, and I am quoting directly, "That's cute, but do you have Tabasco?" The human delegation was seated at table 9. Not because they were considered unimportant, mind you, but because table 9 was positioned near the observation deck, and Ambassador Okonkwo had specifically requested a view. She'd also requested music with what she called a beat, which caused Siveth's crest to shift into a color that in Quelhari culture roughly translates to, "I need a moment." Now, I should explain something about the Centennial Gala's social dynamic, because this matters enormously for everything that follows. There is a tradition at these events called the Informal Accord, a period midway through the gala where delegates circulate freely, share cultural anecdotes, and engage in what the Drossian Collective calls soft diplomacy. What it actually means, in practice, is that everyone stands around trying to seem impressive while subtly establishing hierarchies. The Peluvians were particularly good at this. Their lead delegate, a towering individual named Councillor Verith, had a laugh that sounded like colliding moons and made a point of standing near the observation window so that his silhouette was framed against the nebula outside. Dramatic? Absolutely. Did it work? Every single time. During the informal accord, someone, and to this day no one has fully claimed responsibility, though I have my suspicions about Siveth, introduced Councillor Varath to the human delegation. Varath looked at them the way a planet looks at a pebble. He was 3 meters tall, plated in natural bioceramic, and had personally overseen the strategic reorganization of 2 star systems. He smiled down at the humans with the particular smile of someone who has already written the end of this conversation and found it boring. "Ah," he said, "the Terrans. I understand you are quite new to the convergence." Priya Okonkwo smiled back. 40 years, she said. "We're still figuring out the seating arrangements." She gestured at the table layout. Verith's translator took a moment with that one. The other humans, Attaché Kwame Dziedzich, Science Liaison Dr. Rosie Haruto, Security Officer Benedict Sauer and Cultural Coordinator Lena Volkov arranged themselves with the relaxed posture of people who were either completely at ease or completely unaware of what Varath represented. Later, I would learn it was actually a third option, but we'll get there. Varath, warming to the performance now, tilted his massive head and said, "I have heard interesting things about your species. You are the ones who, how did the report phrase it, survived a series of catastrophic extinction events and considered them formative." He let the sentence hang, expecting embarrassment. Okonkwo said, "5 major ones. We named the worst one after a rock," Kwame Daisetz added, without looking up from the beverage he was examining. "The rock won, technically. We just didn't take the hint." There was a beat of silence. Several nearby delegates had drifted closer, drawn by the particular gravitational pull of a social situation that is either about to go beautifully or catastrophically wrong. At this point, the betting odds, if anyone had been taking them, would have been roughly even. Varath decided he was going to be generous. He laughed, that moon collision laugh, and looked around at the assembled delegates with the expression of someone sharing a joke at a child's expense. "The Deathworld species," he announced, projecting his voice to the wider room with practiced ease. "Truly remarkable. You live on a planet that actively tries to eliminate you. You consider this normal, and you arrive here to tell us about it. Charming, really. Like a pet that survived an obstacle course." He was expecting laughter. He got some. The Peluvian contingent offered polite sounds. A few Quelhari harmonics chimed in. The humans smiled. That was the part that should have been a warning. Not defensive smiles, not uncomfortable smiles. Just smiles. The kind that live on faces that have already done the math and found the answer more interesting than the problem. Dr. Rosie Haruto said, conversationally, "Which part are you finding most remarkable? The surviving 5 extinctions, the planet that produces organisms which consider our military-grade immune response a mild inconvenience, or the bit where we domesticated several apex predators for companionship?" Varath opened his mouth. Haruto continued, in the same pleasant tone, "Because personally, I think the most interesting part is our pain tolerance calibration. But I might be biased. I study xenobiology. The Vorath trauma response, for comparison, triggers at about 14% of the stimulus threshold that a baseline human registers as moderate discomfort. I don't say that to be rude, it's just context." The room had gone quite still. Thum of the Vorath made a sound that his translator rendered as, "I need to reconsider several things." Varath, to his credit, recovered quickly. He was a diplomat, after all, and the mark of a good diplomat is the ability to reload mid-volley. He settled back into his most impressively patronizing register and said, "I admire the spirit, but adaptation to difficult conditions is not the same as strength, little ambassador. Your species may be hardy, but hardiness and capability are—" "Benedict," said Okonkwo without raising her voice. Security Officer Benedict Sauer, who had been standing slightly to the side and saying nothing, looked at her. "Tell Counselor Varath about the hand thing." There was a pause. Sauer looked at Varath with the expression of a man being asked to explain something he considers fairly basic. He said, "Which hand thing?" "Your preference," she said. Sauer considered this. Then he said to Varath with complete conversational calm, "I can break most of my own bones without losing function. Not on purpose, well, sometimes on purpose. The point is the human skeletal structure doesn't shatter, it splinters, keeps you moving. I've completed 3 field operations with fractures that would put most species into systemic shock." He thought about it. The Vorath equivalent would be, "Please don't finish that sentence," said Thum, very quietly. Varath stared at Sauer for a long moment. Then he looked at Okonkwo. Then he looked at all 4 of them, standing there, relaxed, holding their drinks, not threatening anyone, just existing in the particular way that humans apparently exist, which was, it was becoming clear, a form of low-grade threat that required no escalation to be fully effective. "You're doing this on purpose," Varath said. Okonkwo's smile widened just slightly. "Counselor, I'm just having a conversation at a party. You're making a point. I'm making several, she said pleasantly. But none of them are the ones you're worried about. We really did just come for the view. And then, from across the gala floor, one of the Quelhari harmonic singers hit a particularly resonant note, and every single human at table 9 briefly, involuntarily, turned toward the sound and smiled in unison, because apparently that particular frequency hit some ancient human auditory pleasure center, which Siveth would later describe as the most unexpectedly disarming thing he had ever witnessed in 60 years of interspecies events. The tension in the room broke like a fever. Vareth laughed again. But this time it was different. This time it was a laugh that had something uncertain in it, something that hadn't been there before. He excused himself graciously, which is Peluvian for "I need to go recalibrate my assumptions about several things," and drifted back toward his delegation. I was watching from the upper observation ring, taking notes, as is my function. I am archivist Seluin of the Convergence Historical Division, and it is my professional obligation to record everything accurately and without editorializing. My notes for that moment read, "The humans appear to be enjoying themselves. This is somehow worse." No one could have known then that enjoying themselves was about to become the most operationally significant phrase of the entire gala, because 2 hours later, when the station's containment seals failed on sub-level 4, and I do mean failed, not as a metaphor but as in 3 metric tons of malfunctioning atmospheric regulators, a cascade failure in the emergency bulkhead systems, and a very real, very serious depressurization event threatening 400 delegates from 32 species, the humans stopped enjoying themselves, and everything changed. The alarm that sounded across Aurelian Prime was not the polite melodic chime that Siveth had programmed for minor inconveniences like scheduling conflicts or the time a Drossian Mindweaver accidentally broadcast his personal anxieties across the station's communication network. This was the other alarm, the flat, brutal, 3-tone sequence that every species in the Convergence had agreed upon as universal shorthand for "something has gone genuinely, structurally wrong and you should be concerned about continuing to exist." The gala floor reacted the way large groups of diplomats always react to emergencies, which is to say, magnificently poorly. The Peluvian contingent immediately formed a defensive cluster around Councillor Vyrath, which was tactically sensible and completely useless given that the threat was atmospheric rather than physical. The Quelhari harmonic singers began producing a group resonance pattern that their culture uses for crisis centering, which was beautiful and also not helpful. Thum of the Vorath began transmitting urgent requests to his vessel, which was docked 4 levels up and therefore inaccessible. Siveth appeared at the main dais with a prepared emergency announcement that he had clearly rehearsed, delivering it in 6 languages with impeccable diction, while visibly vibrating with barely contained professional horror. The humans were already gone. Not panicked, not running, gone. As in, between one moment and the next, Ambassador Okonkwo and all 4 members of her delegation had simply ceased to be standing where they had been standing and were now somewhere else entirely, moving with a focused, unhurried efficiency that was somehow more alarming than if they had been sprinting. I tracked them on the station's internal monitors because, again, I am an archivist, and also because something in my professional instincts said loudly that this was going to be the most important thing I recorded all evening. Okonkwo had the station schematic pulled up on her personal display before the second alarm cycle completed. I do not know how she obtained it. When I asked her later, she said, "We always pull schematics," and offered no further elaboration, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if every species that attended diplomatic galas spent the pre-event brief studying structural layouts and emergency system overrides. Perhaps they should. They do not. The humans do. Benedict Sauer was already in communication with the station's security chief, a Quelhari named Orveth, who was, through no fault of his own, managing an emergency response system designed around the assumption that the species present would require significant processing time before taking useful action. Sauer did not require significant processing time. He required, from what I observed, approximately 4 seconds to assess the situation, 8 seconds to identify the 3 critical intervention points, and another 12 seconds to explain to Orvath, with careful patience, what needed to happen in what order and why. Orvath later described this experience as being gently overtaken by a very calm river. The depressurization event on sublevel 4 had originated from a maintenance access corridor, a cascading failure in the atmospheric regulators that, left unaddressed for another 9 minutes, would breach the emergency bulkhead and expose a significant portion of the station's lower habitation ring to hard vacuum. 96 station personnel were in that section. The automated response systems had already sealed the primary bulkheads, which bought time but did not solve the underlying problem, because the regulator cascade was still propagating, and the automated systems were not designed to interrupt it mid-sequence without triggering a secondary failure. This was, in the technical terminology of the Convergence Engineering Division, a very bad situation. Dr. Rosie Haruto had apparently known this within 40 seconds of the alarm, having, and I genuinely did not know humans could do this socially, struck up a conversation with one of the station's engineering staff during the gala's first hour, specifically because, as she told me afterward, I always like to know who keeps the lights on. The engineer, a young Quelhari named Ferreth, who had been deeply flattered by a xenobiologist's interest in atmospheric maintenance systems, had explained the regulator layout to her in considerable detail, over canapes. At a diplomatic gala, Haruto found Ferreth in the emergency muster area, spoke to him for approximately 90 seconds, and then the two of them were moving toward a maintenance access panel with the collaborative efficiency of people who had rehearsed this, which they had not, which is somehow the more impressive version of that sentence. Kwame Dzidzic, meanwhile, had done something that I still find difficult to fully categorize as a tactical decision, rather than an act of collective psychology. He walked, deliberately and calmly, to the center of the gala floor, where approximately 340 delegates from 32 species were oscillating between confusion, fear, and the particular diplomatic paralysis that sets in when no one wants to be seen reacting incorrectly in front of their peers. And he started talking, not commanding, not announcing, talking. He introduced himself again, warmly, as though this were a new segment of the evening's program. He said that the situation was being managed, that the humans had some experience with structural emergencies, and that the best thing everyone could do right now was stay clear of the lower decks, and, if they were interested, he could tell them something genuinely fascinating about how human emergency response training had evolved from a period in their history when their buildings regularly fell down. It was, objectively speaking, an absurd thing to say. It worked completely, because Dzidzic had correctly identified that the primary danger in that room was not the atmospheric failure. It was 340 highly intelligent, highly stressed diplomats from species with wildly different crisis responses in a confined space with no clear direction. The Drossian mindweavers were already beginning to bleed low-frequency anxiety emissions that were affecting the Quelhari near them. 2 Peluvian delegates had entered a defensive posture that, if left to escalate, would require formal de-escalation protocols. Thum had stopped responding to his vessel and was standing very still in the way that Vorath stand when they are preparing for something they consider final. Dzidzic talked to them. He made one of them laugh, a Drossian, surprisingly, with a story about a human fire drill that had accidentally evacuated an entire city block because someone had misread the signal, and the subsequent traffic situation had lasted 4 days, and somehow this had become a municipal holiday. He kept his voice level and warm and completely unbothered, and the room, incrementally, breathed. I watched this from my position on the upper ring and wrote in my notes, "The cultural coordinator is performing emotional load-bearing. I don't have a better term for this. He is holding the room up with conversation. I want to study him for a very long time." Down on sublevel 4, Haruto and Ferreth had reached the primary regulator junction. The cascade was at 63% propagation. Orvath's engineering team was 11 minutes out, standard response time, perfectly adequate under normal circumstances, 4 minutes too slow under these ones. Haruto looked at the regulator assembly. Then she looked at Farath. She said, "Walk me through the manual interrupt sequence." Farath said, with genuine distress, "The manual interrupt requires physical pressure on the tertiary valve stem while simultaneously redirecting the secondary flow conduit. It requires, the grip strength needed is, for Quelhari, it would require 2 people, and..." Haruto put her hand on the tertiary valve stem and applied pressure. Farath stopped talking. The valve, which had been rated for Quelhari 2-person operation and had therefore never been questioned as a single operator component, moved. I will not pretend the silence that followed was short. Farath stood very still for what my recording equipment logged as 7 seconds. Then he said, in a very small voice, "The secondary conduit. You have to simultaneously..." "Show me which one," said Haruto. He pointed. She reached, with her other hand, across the assembly, an angle that should not have worked anatomically, which apparently the human skeletal structure's approach to joint flexibility considered a reasonable request, and redirected the flow conduit. The cascade stopped at 67% propagation. The alarm shifted tone from the 3-beat emergency sequence to the 2-beat holding pattern that meant crisis contained, system stabilizing. On the gala floor, Dzidzik was mid-sentence about a human phenomenon called a potluck when the tone change occurred. He paused, listened to it with the focused attention of someone whose internal clock had been running the entire time, and then smiled, genuinely, unperformatively, and said, "There it is." The room exhaled. Up in the maintenance corridor, Orveth's engineering team arrived to find Haruto and Farath sitting on the floor next to the regulator assembly, Farath explaining in increasingly animated detail the full specifications of the atmospheric maintenance network, because Haruto had asked a follow-up question, and Farath, being Quelhari, was constitutionally incapable of giving an incomplete answer to a sincere inquiry. Sauer had already coordinated the evacuation of Sub-Level 4 through Orveth's team, accounting for 3 Vorath personnel who required specialized atmospheric support during the transfer, and 1 Peluvian maintenance worker, who had barricaded herself in a storage unit under the impression that the emergency was a different kind of emergency. He had talked her out of the storage unit by explaining, calmly, that the specific emergency in progress was structural rather than hostile, and that he had personally verified the corridor was clear, and that he understood her concern was valid, and that he would walk beside her to the muster point if that was useful. She later sent Ambassador Okonkwo a formal letter of gratitude that Peluvian diplomatic protocol required be written in verse. Okonkwo had it framed by the time Orveth's full engineering team had the system under control and the all-clear was issued. The humans had returned to the gala floor. Not to the center of it, not to make an entrance or receive acknowledgement. They drifted back to Table 9 near the observation deck window, and Okonkwo procured a replacement drink from a passing service unit and looked out at the nebula and said, to no one in particular, "Still a beautiful view." Counselor Vareth found her there, 20 minutes later. He was not accompanied by his usual cluster of Peluvian aides. He came alone, which in Peluvian social terms means the conversation that follows is not diplomatic, it is personal. He stood beside her at the window for a moment. Then he said, "I was told what happened on Sub-Level 4, Okonkwo said. Farath did most of it. Good instincts, that one." Vareth was quiet. Outside, the nebula shifted, a slow, massive motion of gas and light that made everything near it look very small and very temporary. He said finally, "At the start of the evening, I made a comparison. A pet that survived an obstacle course. I remember," she said. "I was incorrect." Okonkwo looked at him for the first time in the conversation. She said, "No, actually. We are shaped by surviving difficult things. That part was accurate." She looked back at the window. "You just missed the part where surviving difficult things doesn't make you fragile. It makes you..." She paused, choosing the word, "calibrated." Vareth considered this for a long time. The kind of long time that means a very large mind is restructuring something it had previously considered settled. He said, "You studied the station schematics before the event. Standard practice. For whom?" She smiled. "For us." Seveth appeared at Verath's elbow, because Seveth appeared at everyone's elbow eventually. It was less a personality trait and more a physical law. He looked between the two of them with his crest cycling through a sequence of colors that I, reviewing the recording later, identified as confused, cautious, and cautiously optimistic in that order. He said, "The remainder of the gala program can continue if the delegations are amenable. The harmonic performance has been rescheduled to—" "Yes," said Okonkwo. "Absolutely. We came for the music." And that was the thing, you see. The thing that Verath was still processing when he walked back to his delegation. The thing that Ferath would tell colleagues about for the next 20 years. The thing that I wrote in my official archival report in the plainest language I could find, because plain language was the only kind that did it justice. They had come for the music. They had studied the schematics anyway. They had managed the crisis efficiently and without announcement, and gone back to their table because the evening wasn't over and the view was still good. The Convergence would spend the next several decades debating how to formally categorize the humans. What tier, what designation, what level of strategic consideration. Committees were formed, reports were written. The Drossian Collective produced a 17-volume psychological analysis that concluded, after considerable deliberation, that humans were contextually unpredictable in a directional way, which is either very insightful or completely meaningless depending on your perspective. Thum of the Vorath submitted a single-page addendum to the official record that read, in its entirety, "Do not confuse casualness for incapacity. I was present. I will not make this error again." Councillor Vyrath voted, when the formal designation came to council, for the highest tier. When asked to explain his reasoning, he said only that he had stood at a window with Ambassador Okonkwo and watched a nebula, and that she had talked about the view, and he had understood, somewhere in the part of his mind that assessed threats for a living, that she was also describing themselves. "I am archivist Saluin, and I have recorded 400 years of Convergence history. I have documented wars and their endings, species that rose and species that did not, moments of extraordinary courage and moments of extraordinary foolishness, and occasionally, on the best days, moments where the two were indistinguishable. I will note, for the record, that when the harmonic singers resumed their performance that evening, every member of the human delegation closed their eyes. They looked, for just a moment, completely at peace. It was the most unsettling thing I saw all night.